Welcome back to the Tomb, everyone. You already know who it is. Tomb Talks with the Pharaoh. And for today's episode, it's called The Science of the Swole. And I have a very important guest with me today. And I'll have him go ahead and introduce himself, and we'll just get right into it.
Thanks, Ollie. Always great to sit down and talk. We have some crazy conversations sometimes, so we'll see where this one takes us. My name's Teofe Ziemnicki. I am a sports scientist by trade. Originally a strength coach. Made the transition pretty much the past year. But me and Ollie went to UMass together, and like I said, I'm interested to see how the talk goes and where it takes us because we always have some crazy conversations. So glad to be here, man.
Glad for you to be here, because when I told you, because when we talked about doing this, it was at a friend's wedding, and we would pretty much had the podcast episode talk on the way, like on the bus to the venue. I'm just like, fuck, I wish we recorded this.
Yeah, we went on some tangents there. It was good though. It was real good.
Oh, so many tangents. And
Yeah.
then after that, that's when the alcohol started hitting. I was just like, damn, I can't remember what we spoke about.
It was everything all at once.
Yes,
Always.
ev- everywhere. No, but so you said that you're a sports scientist by trade.
Yep.
You went to the University of Swole, and you got a PhD in pump.
Yeah,
So
exactly.
no, but could you actually give like a little bit of the background of like your education, and then from there, like some places that you've worked at?
Yeah, definitely. So I did my undergrad at UMass, like I said. Majored in psychology. Originally thought I wanted to go into research. Found out very quickly that that lifestyle is not for me. I needed something a little bit more active, a little bit more yeah, fast paced, let's say. So worked as a personal trainer in Boston for almost about 2 years, and I'd played sports my entire life. Needed something a little bit more competitive because the population I was working in was just general population, just wasn't for me. So went back and got my master's in Kentucky, and wound up at Yale University for about 5 years, 6 years as a strength and conditioning coach. And my time there, I kind of fell into the analytics and data side of sports. Um, Currently, it's an up and coming field. I mean, I think commercially, you'll notice if you watch the NFL or most major league sporting events have some sort of analytics component to it now. You'll see it a lot with like Amazon data services will show like the odds of the fourth and however long, or the
Yeah,
odds of a field goal kick. So commercially, you'll see it in that end, but most of my work is spent analyzing movements, um, putting numbers and metrics to certain let's say concepts or ideas that a sports coach or strength coach might have, and kind of trying to quantify certain things within the realm of sports that were originally questions or maybe thoughts and feelings that people had previously, trying to put a number behind those things and make it a little more actionable when it comes to the gaining performance out of athletes or just an overall organization. So that's kind of, I guess, the general gist of kind of what I do, and trying to, where I'm at now, I try to help strength coaches and sport coaches try to actualize and visualize all the information they collect on a regular basis. So that's a quick snapshot of what I've done and where I'm at now.
okay. And you said that you were personal training in Boston for 2 years, and you said it wasn't competitive enough for you.
No, it's quite a bit of the people that are looking just to move around for an hour, get sweaty, and then leave. So it's
Gotcha.
yeah, there's not you're not really there's a place, there's a time and place for that, and if you're doing that, then good for you. But that would just wasn't necessarily what I wanted to do for my entire life. So
Gotcha.
yeah.
So I guess because you studied psychology
Mhm.
in undergrad, it's like what prompted you to go into sports science? Were you with psychology? Were you trying to do sports psychology or?
Yeah, that was kind of like the original thought. Looking to get my master's in sports psychology originally, and I found out like going and meeting a lot of like who my colleagues would have been, I realized quickly that my personality doesn't fit well in a lot of the rooms. And that's not to say they're bad people. It's just that's not how I operated. Um,
What were they
so
fucking boring?
I, they some points, yeah. Um, and there sports psychology is an important field. That's, the act of getting yourself mentally prepared for a game, and there's certain techniques that you can kind of utilize and pull on. That's, it's interesting, it's important, but I think for me it was a little too mundane. I needed to be a little bit more in a high stress environment, like a weight room, where it's, you're actively able to better yourself in a tangible way on a consistent basis, right? And that kind of lend itself to the metric side of things, where I really just enjoyed saying, like, if we do X, Y, and Z, we can expect an output of this. And that's kind of how, as a strength coach, I fell into the sports science side of things, of like being able to project and understand certain things have certain reactions, and we can account for certain things, and we can expect a certain net result, and that's going to lead to effectively more wins in the win column at the end of the day. So I took the statistical side of my time in the psychology major and started to apply, effectively what you do as a researcher in trying to understand certain aspects of psychology. You're trying to quantify certain things, right? And they're very abstract things at times. So taking that and applying to the sports setting, where some things are certainly abstract in what a coach might view as good or bad, and
Mhm.
taking that abstract concept that a coach's eye might see, like, oh, that person's slow, that person's fast. Well, why might that be for that particular person, right? And then how can we take what we know from a physiology standpoint, make that person better and make them a better athlete? So um I guess that's kind of how I went from like that psychology aspect of like understanding like those crazy concepts that people kind of like come up and think about, and
Mhm.
then going into that research side of like, all right, well, we know, or we think this might be true, how do we go about verifying that?
Verifying it. Yes.
Yeah, and that's kind of how those two worlds bled together, I guess. So definitely unconventional, 100%. I did not have a conventional background when it comes to this stuff. So
Yeah, but I feel like with the psychology of it though, it's that it like you said is unconventional, but it gives you kind of a different lens that you can look through, that someone who might be more classically trained in sports science, they might look at the same problem in a different way, but it might be all the same way that classical people have been trained to look at it.
totally. And I think that, I mean, cross training or cross kind of like, I don't know, not necessarily cross contamination of ideas, but just like taking ideas from other avenues, ventures, and trying to apply them to your situation is always going to yield a better result, right? Like, because it's going to give you that perspective, it's going to give you that lens, like you said, of being able to step outside of your realm and saying, "Hey, this works really well here. Why doesn't it work really well here? Or how could it work really well for us, given our context?" I think that's vitally important, 100%.
100%. And with the journey that you were saying is that you kind of went down this analytic rabbit hole. My question would be, is that in the context of sports science, is it just like a niche thing to be in analytics, or is that kind of where sports science is moving to?
I definitely, well, and this is, and when I speak on a lot of this stuff, it's going to be like for the US and the American side of things, because sports science has been around a little bit longer, I guess, in a popular sense
Mhm.
in Europe, Australia, and other parts of the world. It's definitely a little more fine tuned over there. I think here it's grown so much, and you had a lot of people that were applied in the sense of they were a sport coach or they were a strength coach that turned into an analytics driven person. Now, so you have an influx of analytics people that go through the classical, like you said, classical training of, data analytics or data science, and then trying to take that and then apply it to sport. Uh, and I think when dealing with sports, there's still such a raw human component to sports that if you don't have that ability to connect and convey on an interpersonal level, a lot of analytics still get lost, whether they are right or wrong.
Mhm.
So I think now, so you're seeing it more in the states of these, you have high end analytical people that may just be very data heavy people. Um, but it's hard to take all that concept and apply it to an area where historically math, statistics, and science have not been applied, right? So you have a clashing of worlds where the decision makers never had really had to go through that type of environment, schooling or academia, right? Of a very math intensive background. And you have these very math intensive background people stepping into that world. And you kind of get a clash at some points. And that's not to say it's endemic um, through the entire field, but you're starting to see it certainly because people do see they're starting to see the value in analytics and data in sports, but then they're starting to look in areas and pull from areas that people may not have the expertise or language of sports,
to
in the
convey
sense
it.
of, yeah, like working in athletics is crazy sometimes. And if you've
Yeah.
never worked in athletics, sometimes it's hard to understand like what happens behind the curtains, right? So I think getting someone that's never been in that environment and trying to pull them into it and just like get them to thrive can be challenging, certainly.
And especially with like analytics, like statistical analysis, like it's hard in general for people to explain that.
Totally.
Um, because I remember in grad school, my biostats teacher would always hammer home to us is that it's like statistics is telling a story. How are you going to tell the story? And if
Hmm.
you can't tell it, then those numbers are essentially meaningless.
100%. It's like trying to read a book that's not in your native language and you've never spoken it, never written it before, right? Because you understand that there's meaning behind it, but if you don't have the context or someone's not there to guide you through that in the proper way, you'll never get or understand what's going on, right? It's going to take a lot of more work. And data presentation should be effortless and consumable by anybody. Like that's effective communication using visuals, right? Like it should be understood for anyone that's looking at it. So the complexity of the view needs to match the audience, and there's certain times to be very complex, and there's certain times to be very remedial. And that's not to say that there's anything right or wrong with either of those, but the message that gets put through and understood the most, that is the proper response. So
Yes, and having those that can actually explain a complex concept in a very remedial way to someone who's not privy to the jargon or even like what type of analysis, because I feel like a lot of times people who are in these spaces of analytics, they get so wrapped up in performing the act of the analysis that by the time they get to the conclusion and have to explain to the people, it's it's so complex that only the person and like other people on their level in their field can even understand it. So it's like, why am I paying you
yeah,
for this data if the data doesn't actually translate into, like you said, wins, better performances, things like that.
yeah, 100%. And I think it's an easy example to relate all of this would be like, I think most people can think back to their time in college where they had a professor that was extremely intelligent at what they did, was very, very good at the craft, but maybe didn't always teach to the class in the most appropriate way to get the lesson across. Right. And there were
Yeah, there's
certain
order for
times,
me.
yeah, literally, there's been plenty of times where I can think back. I've had some very, and I'm not taking away their intelligence or their ability in their field, but to teach to a group of college students, and have everyone thrive and succeed. And that's a hard ask of anybody. That's to have 100% success rate. That's very hard to find. But you've oftentimes can think back to a professor that you had that just never clicked with the audience, could never really, speak to everyone in the class in a language that everyone could understand, but still convey these important concepts to them for them to understand and meet them where they're at. Cause that's really what it is, right?
Yeah.
So communication is meeting everyone where they're at. And sometimes it starts small and then you build from there. That way everyone can kind of, catch up and be along. Um, but it's the ability to switch and understand that and either, ratchet down very quickly or start down and ratchet up at the speed that everyone can handle at. And it's really anywhere, but I think when it comes to data can be a scary thing for a lot of people because it is, it's there
It's
right in your
numbers.
face. It's
Too many
numbers.
numbers.
Yeah, exactly.
Like,
So
we doing 2 plus 2? What type of sorcery is
the
this?
numbers, Mason, what do they mean?
What
It's
do they mean?
so it's yeah, I mean, and I enjoy data analytics because I think it's a fun puzzle to solve and how to display it so everyone can understand it, right? So
Mhm. And especially with those, with the professors that you're talking about, is that you'll have some that can't convey to the audience, but then you'll have some, and I've had two professors come to mind for me with this, but you'll have some that are happy about the fact
oh
that
yeah,
people are failing their class, and it's just like, it's like, oh, like only 10% of people will even get a passing grade. It's like, how are you still working here?
like it's a badge of honor or something, you know?
Yeah, so like that's more of a reflection on your teaching ability than the actual rigor of the content.
Yeah, 100%. And it's silly, man. It happens everywhere. It's nuts. But
But I definitely think that people who are in like that probably get into sports science, especially sports science analytics, um, I think that it should be a requirement in some classes, some programs, to take public speaking, or like to take a class that teaches you how to interact and engage with an audience that is not of the scientific background, so that you can actually convey and make yourself useful to that to that audience.
I mean, I totally agree.
And
I I
I,
don't know how you go about formatting that class, but I mean, that would be phenomenal. It's and I always say to people that are looking to get like into sports science is like, spend some time in a weight room, spend some time around people that you're going to have conversations with on a daily basis, learn their language. It's important, you know?
well, I think that you can format it in a way like this: is that during grad school, I had a seminar that I took that was essentially teaching how to do presentations, like PowerPoint presentations, the aesthetic, like certain things, like the
Mm.
do's and don'ts. And then like for the majority of the class, we ended up just having to present over and over and over again until like we felt comfortable standing up and presenting to different groups of like different audiences. Because one of the exercises that we did is that we would have we would say like, okay, if I was, you would pick a topic. I picked like black holes,
Mm.
and for that, the professor picked the audience in which I'd be speaking to. So I think he picked like seventh graders. So now I have to take something that like quantum physics and break it down in a way that I can explain it to a group of seventh graders. And it's stuff like that where I think that if you have like a seminar for people in sports science analytics and saying like, okay, you're going to be explaining this data to the football team.
Mm.
That's one audience. You might, and then the next project could be, you now have to explain this to school administration, which has a whole list of other stakeholders and motivations behind why this data will be important to them.
100%. I mean, it's the experience you had sounds like I mean, extremely valuable because being able to break something down for, kids to effectively understand, like that's you hear this expression is what, explain it like I'm five, right? Explain it like you're explaining it to a 5 year old. Like that's vitally important. Like the ability to look at someone and say, hey, you may not understand everything that I'm going to say, but I'm going to try to break it down in terms that you can probably understand it in. Like that's and we said it earlier, like data is a form of communication, and it's almost as if it's a painting that you have to explain, right?
Mhm.
There's visuals, right, that go along with it, but you kind of need to look at those and say, hey, this is what these nooks and crannies kind of mean. Like this is what the nitty gritty really is, and I want you to pull and understand, the gap that we're experiencing or how close we are to achieving something that could be great, right? And
Yeah.
you use the visual to back up your understanding. Um, because I always say this, and I say, data it should be treated as a gateway to a conversation. It's not where the conversation ends, right? You
Mm.
can't end a conversation with data always. It has to open up a conversation because there's always more context. There's always a different layer to peel back. Um, I think it's really tough sometimes to see people you try to use data as a way to just end a conversation wholeheartedly. I always think there's maybe a little bit more there that needs to be expressed, right? And that has to come through communication, has to come through dialogue. So,
Yeah, it's like that example that that people give all the time is that in terms of data, it's like, oh, the sale of ice cream during the summer goes up, but then but then the rate of murders also goes up.
right,
Therefore, it's like ice cream is causing more murders. That's data. There you go. It's just like,
right,
no, we need to have a like a nuanced conversation about this. Is like, and like you said, peel back the layers and ask the questions of how is this data collected,
mhm,
who is this data collected on, and how and what does this data mean for the stakeholders and the participants that offer this data.
yeah. It's it, and I mean, you kind of get that when you have like a research heavy background in school, right? Because you go through like research methods, but not everybody has that, and not everybody goes through that. So I mean, you definitely learn some critical, you know, let's say critical diagnostic skills when it comes to research, of being like you have to peel through like, oh, who did the study, why did they do the study, what did they find, what does the study mean, what does it lend itself to, are the results really significant, right?
Yeah.
And in your explanation of information, like that's kind of what has to come forth. It's almost like you have to go back to that and be like, all right, what did I find in my time analyzing this information? Why is it important? Who does it lend itself to? Who's going to find this to be um, useful, right? And then
Mm.
how are they going to interpret that? It's almost like it takes another step where, like you said, having a class where you're teaching something to someone that has no idea what you're talking about, like that would be the next step after like research methods, right? Is explaining that to someone that has never taken that course in their life. That's the not necessarily the missing piece, but that's the next step, right? So
Yes, and especially coming from my background with public health, is that we can use all the data we want and have all these statistics, have all these studies and everything like that. And it's like, but if we can't accurately convey that information to like a policymaker or a politician or the head of a department or administration somewhere, it's that it doesn't, we can't even do our job of public health because it's not actually being disseminated out to a public. It's being just collecting dust on a shelf somewhere. Something I wanted to ask you is that because we've been talking about data, sports
mhm.
science data, what type of like what does the data look like? Like what is some data that you've collected and analyzed to help your programs?
Yeah, and I think when we say the word data and we talk about this, it's always people look for this giant like missing link, right? Sometimes it's as simple as like someone collecting attendance information to showcase why someone's not improving. Sometimes it's as complex as stringing together a few different pieces of information like power output, anthropometrics, like hand, wrist, arm
Anthropo what?
size, anthropometrics. So like just like
So
limb length, like
you're gonna have to go ahead and describe and
body,
define.
like body measurements, different aspects in that sense. Sorry. Jargon. So
Pretend
taking
I'm five.
taking something like your wingspan, and then projecting that against your height, and then also relating that to your power output, and then understanding where on a field you might fall for a position, right?
Mhm.
Like it's trying to answer questions that people have that have never had access to the information that we can collect currently. That's kind of what it is. So it can be as simple, like I said, as simple as like just attendance that's always been collected, but then you rate that against performance, and sometimes performance looks different for different people, right? Performance in a sport looks different than performance in the weight room, and performance in the weight room looks a lot different from weight room to weight room. So the information that I consistently work with, I try to meet people, like I said before, where they're at, the availability for them to collect information, and their availability to process it on their own on a regular basis. Um, the stuff that, some of the stuff that I was doing previously at Yale was like we were trying to figure out how we could profile for certain positions, particularly when it comes to football. And it's like, what does a wide receiver look like? What would make a great one? What makes,
Like,
you know,
what does
a
a
re-
wide receiver look like? Or
no, what body metrics does a wide receiver need? What does a defensive back need? What does an offensive lineman need? That in that sense.
well, I think a DB, one of the prerequisites is that they need locks.
One of the prerequisites. We
It makes
I
it
don't know
more
if we ever came
it makes us
across
more
that.
aerodynamic.
There's I don't know if I can put a number behind that one. Um
Do
I
yeah, just do a lock a lock to 40 ratio.
to ratio, right,
Yeah.
right, right. I'll look at that and I'll see what I can come up with. How about that? I'll report to you
You'll
directly.
end up on a front page somewhere.
Yeah, somewhere. Yeah, exactly. No, it's we tried to quantify everything we could, and I mean the process that it takes is like you start big and then you whittle it down, right? Like
Mhm.
you start with the things that you can collect, and then from there chunk through like what makes sense and what doesn't make sense based on the outcome you're seeing. And you always want to set it up against the standard, right? You're always going to have people that come through that perform at a very high level, and then you look at that as a marker, right? And that may be the marker you're trying to achieve consistently because it's output. If that
Mhm.
person's able to output consistently at a high level, what are their metrics? What makes them great? And you try to look at everything, and then you say, all right, well, this doesn't really make sense based off of maybe a correlation, right? Like the correlation between, foot size and performance probably isn't very high at all.
Yeah.
But we saw that like certain things, like if you were at least +5 wingspan to height and your power output was at a certain level, to be a defensive back, that's super important because your whole goal as a defensive back is to close down time and space and effectively keep that airtight, right? So the longer your arms compared to your height at a and obviously a certain height level is important, right? You can't be 5'1" run around, but
Hey, hey,
not at a
don't
high
diss
level
Rudy.
anyways.
Don't
Not
diss Rudy.
Rudy never won a national championship.
Yeah.
So
He would have scored low on your metrics.
probably, yeah. So
But can you
when
measure heart?
maybe. um so when you're looking at like a position like that where it's just closing down time and space, like wingspan to height ratio at a certain level is going to be important, and then how much power they can produce on a consistent basis is going to be important too, because if you can't produce force at an optimal level, like you're never going to be able to keep up with someone that's operating at you know at the highest level they possibly can at all times, right? So looking at things like that, like that's the stuff that we really tried to hone in on and get to, and that's kind of like a small snapshot of some of the things that we looked at from a data standpoint, right? So
Mhm. And with some of the examples that you gave, like obviously height, weight, wingspan, like those are things that you can easily measure.
right.
Now, about like power output, is that something like are you measuring that like how they do at the I guess at the combine where they'll have them reps like 225 for however much and then do a calculation there, or do you have it do you have machines where it literally like you just have to push hard one time and then like that can give you a depiction of it?
Yeah, yeah. So definitely machines. Um, what is utilized in most sense, the easiest way is going to be what they call a force plate. That all you really need to do is just do any maneuver on, and it's going to give you an output. So we would generally have people jump on a force plate to understand their lower body power output. You can certainly have them do an explosive push up off of it to understand a little bit more. We would, we had talked about and looked at that kind of test for our linemen, right? Because they're consistently,
Yeah,
shocking,
pushing.
shocking and trying to maneuver. Um, so looking at output and then other metrics that that device can give you as a way to quantify like what makes someone good at what they do, and then how can we replicate that over and over again to kind of narrow down our variance in wins and losses. So using a force plate was super important. You can calculate it roughly based off body weight and vertical jump height.
Mhm.
Something like the combine, and this is kind of like something that's interesting to think about too, is like bench press is a good marker of just strength, but the longer your arms, the harder it is to bench. But you're also producing more torque and power because that lever arm is much longer, right?
Mhm.
So looking in conjunction of that can actually give you, like, you may only be able to bench press like 10 reps at 225, but if your wingspan's like 7'2", like that's pretty impressive, right?
Yeah.
10 reps doesn't sound like a lot for someone that plays at a high level, but like someone with really, really long arms, that's a lot of power output going on, right, in that upper body. So it's going to be better served to have them do so tests like on force plates because that's much more refined. Um, but just like a train of thought, it's not always like, it won't always be like the highest number of reps, because some of the best benchers in the world, pound per pound, have very, very short arms because
Yeah.
it's a
Little
distance thing.
stubby arms.
Yeah, and if you're a defensive lineman, like where that your battles are won within 5 feet of each other, you want to be as far away as possible to, maneuver around, right? To create that gap in space, as
Mhm.
opposed to a different position group where you want to close time and space. So different thoughts, different ways to think about things, different ways to look about things. And that's just using that as like kind of an anecdote.
So with the amount of data that uh, you're collecting and using that for decision making, I know I joked about it's like, well, you can't measure heart, but on a real note, is that with all of this data collection and putting a certain emphasis on the data to make decisions, does that remove like the human aspect from like a player's ability to perform?
Yeah, totally. At a certain level, for sure. I mean, think of it this way: like, how humanized is insurance rating?
Mhm.
You know what I mean? Like, I don't think we'll ever get to that level necessarily, right? Where it's like you don't have a conversation with anybody about what your rates are. It's all just probabilities. It has everything to do with location, and I'm talking about like insurance for like a car, right? Your car insurance.
Yeah.
Um, Literally the most unhumanized thing that you could possibly think of. It's you tell them where you're at, what kind of car you have, and they're like, "Oh, this is your number. This is what you pay per month." Um, I think with sports is always going to have a level of human to it, like a level of, because you're dealing with people directly day to day, whether whether you want to or not, right? Like, if whether you want to be a data guy or not, like, there's certain things that you're not going to be able to quantify, right? Like, you can't really quantify heart, right? But there's certain things that you can quantify that can at least put people into uh, a position to succeed, right? So um, I think setting yourself up in a an environment where you can utilize data as a way, again, to open up a conversation to say, this person looks like they fit in this position, this person looks like they fit well over here, and alternatively, people can use data like GPS to understand how much load in a practice someone could handle.
Mhm.
And that's actually like a regulator to say, like, hey, we know that like the body has limits, like, let's tamper down on our expectations at times because we're still dealing with people here, right? And you're also dealing with a human element that, like, things happen outside of the four walls of a gym, things happen out of the four corners of a field. Like, there's all, like, it doesn't matter what the data says. Sometimes you have to have a critical understanding of who you're dealing with, what they need to do, and how they need to perform on a regular basis, and what that means for them, what their information means for them. So I don't think it'll ever lose the human aspect to it. Um, I think there's certain things that you can do to kind of take away some of the uncontrollables that may live now, right?
Mhm.
So I think there's definitely ways to do that and make your probability a little bit more in your favor for certain scenarios and circumstances. So, but it'll never be 100%. So,
And something that you brought up is that using it to essentially kind of avoid injury.
mhm.
Um, with with how data driven like decisions are being made, does that force people to operate more so in like a deficit model or an asset model, like having, like, I guess telling coaches don't do this versus it's like, hey, this thing might be more beneficial than what you've normally been doing.
Definitely the latter. It's very hard to tell someone that they can't do something, especially when it comes to a sport coach that's running their team. It's always important to offer up an alternative or a different lens to look at their plan, right? Because it's always going to be tough for someone to plan something and then another person comes in and says, we can't do it that way, because their immediate reaction is going to be why. You can show them everything in the world and they could still say no, right?
Mhm.
If there's no alternative option offered, if there's no dialogue that's opened up beyond that, you're going to have a tough time, right? And that kind of goes back to why I think people that want to work in a sports or athletic environment need to experience it first, because it can be very, hey, let's look at this, we should do it this way, and then people are always like, people will literally look at you and say no, right, just flat out, and they just completely do something different, right?
Mhm.
Because there's still kind of that whole, we've always done it this way, it's always been this way.
That old school mentality.
Yeah, I did this when I was younger and we still won, not recognizing that the game has changed tenfold in probably the past 5 years alone. So
Mhm.
it's like, it's it's kind of, it has that, there's definitely that vibe to it at times, 100%. Um,
And with that
so
has like, do old, like, have you seen it that older coaches tend to be a little bit more resilient to the data coming in and like being an asset?
definitely at times, definitely
Okay.
at times, and there's definitely people that are closer in our age that are apprehensive too.
Mhm.
Um, it's, again, it definitely lends itself, because I mean, when you really look at the amount of tech that has been infused into sports in the past 10 years, it's, we're talking like leaps and bounds from what happened in like the 80s, and people that played in the 80s are coaching. Do you know what I
Mhm.
mean? Like it's almost a completely different world now that athletes live in
Yeah, they
than
actually
what.
have hard helmets now.
Yeah, exactly. And I mean, even that's still being refined and looked at, right? Like it's not perfect.
Yeah.
Um, but I mean, you can still say that the game is getting more, you know, fast paced, more violent, right? Because the faster and more powerful people become, the more powerful the collisions are. And it's like, if the gear doesn't catch up to the game itself, then, you know, it's a moot point at that point. But
That's when
um
you get instances like with what was it?
talking about
Uh
Tua.
well, Tua, that was just they just gave him an ibuprofen and said get back out there.
You're gonna throw the ball.
It's like he gonna throw the ball and he ended up just, the only thing he was throwing was gang signs with his hands.
Yeah, dude, that
Uh,
was wild.
no, the brother that was on Buffalo.
Oh, Damar Hamlin. Yeah.
Yes, and because when I'll say this, when just, of course I'm not a doctor, but I dabbled very much so in like the medical field and just
Yeah.
I almost want I wanted to be a doctor. So I actually learned about anatomy and shit like that. Seeing that collision and seeing how like he got up and then fell, it's like I could tell straight up like from that is that it was a compression of the rib cage and like not having the tech to be able to withstand something. It's
Mhm.
like you said, it's like you're gonna start seeing more injuries at like where you didn't see them before, only because people are stronger now.
Yeah. I mean, the emphasis on strength training it's been around for, I would say, the past 15 years, especially in the football setting. Other sports, not so much, but football for sure but you're also seeing like the hyper specialization, like the more likelihood that you can get and play in any sport that's going to offer kind of like a point where you can effectively be set for life from a monetary standpoint. Like, it's going to bring about the people that can succeed the best. And generally, that is people that can create or negate time and space as quickly as possible, which lends itself back to power output, force output. Because the more force and power you can put in the ground at any moment and repeatedly do that, the better you're going to be at any sport. Because again, it's the separation or closing of time and space at a rapid movement, and that goes back to power and force. So as it becomes more and more beneficial to be good at those things, people will get more hyper skilled at the skill of the sport who happen to be very powerful, right? It's
Mhm.
just gonna it's a selection point, right? So and that's not to say that's every position, right? Because different positions require different things, but for the most part, and that's not to say for every sport either, but for the most part, um, that's what you see. So
Yeah, people are just getting faster and faster. Like the world record for the 100-meter, like 30, 40 years ago, when you look at it like what it is now, like 9.58. That's almost video game like
yeah,
times. And no one would like when someone broke 10, they thought it was a big thing. It's like, oh, like it's like no one's gonna be able to do this ever again. It's just like, and then Usain Bolt comes along. It's just like, oh no, like we're doing 9.5s around here.
does it consistently too. That's
Yeah,
at any age really. So, but I mean, again, so like you'll have those crazy moments, and I think in the case of Damar Hamlin, like I'm not at all a medical professional. You have to think though that that was a split second thing where like everything lined up for that moment to necessarily happen,
yeah,
right? So, um, but we look at things like concussions, like that's being heavily studied and looked at, and it should be, it's rightfully so. But again, going back to the game becoming more powerful, more violent, because that's what the sport kind of necessitates is speed, power, production on a consistent basis. It's as people get more powerful, more strong, and people start to refine their process to get people to that point. Um, the technology has to match. It has to accelerate at the rate that everything else in performance is currently doing.
100%. And with that, with technology being a thing, what is some of the technology that you have now that you wish you had earlier in your career?
I mean, definitely force plates. They're becoming more and more commercially available. But I think starting out in my time at Yale, I think I wish we had those 100%, because that would have been, I would have liked to have more time spent with those than just a couple years.
Mhm.
Um, because I think really only scratching the surface, and there's so much information there. So it's kind of like it's almost like putting your car in like one of those like machines that just like does all the torque, does all the
Oh, the
horse.
dynamo.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, exactly. It's kind of like one of those, but for athletics. So
Okay. And so, and with that, with the force plate,
mhm,
like I guess the way that I'm kind of thinking about it, it's like you said, like you would just have them jump.
mhm.
From there, would you be able to distinguish as like, oh, the person favors like their left leg more so than right, and that might show like you might be prone to injury there. Is that like a thing that
Yeah,
you'd be able to?
yep. Because there's two separate force plates that you can jump on, and you straddle it right and left. But the other thing too is that like how much asymmetry is okay, because a left tackle is not going to look like a linebacker, because a left tackle is constantly kick pushing. You know,
Mhm,
back onto their left side, and like how much asymmetry for them is reasonable versus someone that is, let's say, a linebacker, like a middle linebacker, where they're playing a little bit more both sides of the field, right? So that those are the kind of things that I wish I was able to identify more, because I don't think I got the opportunity to really do that on a granular level with the time that I had with those, because it kicks out, the ones we had kicked out probably, I want to say it was like 150 metrics, so like 150 pieces of information per jump or per movement, right?
mhm.
So not everything's going to be applicable to every single person, but the opportunity to whittle that down, given the context of the person that I was working with, to identify what makes them really good or what could make them really good. I that's something I wish I probably wish I spent 6 years on as opposed to just a couple. So
And you said that was, did you say at Yale that's when you first had them, or was that
mhm.
okay?
Yeah, the final like probably a year, probably close to two, the final 2 years I was there, and part of that time was marred by uh the restrictions that were placed on us for COVID reasons. So um
Oh, I thought it
that
was the other. I thought it was the other restrictions.
right, yeah, the other ones. The yeah, the that one year, the first year we had him, we weren't at full capacity. So I and when everybody got back, it was like kind of a toss up where everybody was. So I wouldn't say everybody coming back was like in their peak physical shape or peak performance shape.
Hmm.
Probably now so. Now that they've got a whole full year, couple years under their belt. But yeah, I think from a context standpoint, it probably wasn't the best data that I was ever looking at either, to understand certain things or certain inferences that I might have had or certain questions people had asked. So
Okay. Um. Well, I do want to ask you
mhm.
because you were there during the whole Yale college thing, like with the
Varsity Blues, is that what you're talking about?
yeah the varsity blues thing. You were there during it, correct?
Yeah, I was.
Did you ever work with any of like the teams that like were affected by that?
Um, I do know that the teams that were affected by that were definitely devastated. It's a lot
Yeah.
to take in.
Hmm.
Um, it was tough to see
Yeah.
because it wasn't at that moment, it was no longer about athletics or the reasons why a lot of the kids that were there wanted to be there for, and that was to play the game. Um, it sucked to see those kids go through that. As I'm sure because it was made into a Netflix series, wasn't it? I still haven't watched it.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah. It was. Um.
as juicy and as fun as it was, I'm sure for people on the outside to see it happen and to think like, oh, they got. Um, I think there was an equal reaction, equal and opposite reaction from the people that had to go through that, especially the kids and the girls that were honestly there for the reason that they were there for, and that was to play the game that
To
they
play the
loved.
game. Yeah.
Yeah. Um, and
Yeah. I do feel bad for them because
it
it's like
definitely affected them. I had,
yeah.
and it sucked to see. Um, and I'm not excusing the behavior of the people that went through that, right? Like it's not it's not fair, right? Because um it stains a lot of what the girls that were honest about how they got there for, or
Yeah.
any of the athletes that got there for, right? So I have a different perspective on it, I
Hmm.
guess. And it was like one of those things where it's not like it's not like people weren't surprised. People were shocked, right? Like it was one of those things where it was just like they're like, oh man, like how could this actively happen?
Yeah.
So
And I don't know because from I guess from the standpoint of the children of the celebrities that were involved in it, um, I don't remember how much involvement they had in it versus like their parents were taking care of it.
right,
Uh, the only reason, like the part where I feel bad for the kids of the celebrities, is because now your parents think you're dumb because it's
they
like
they put you there because they wanted you there.
yeah, they put you like it was like, oh, they ain't getting into Harvard. Let me spend this money. Like it was like it's hard to rationalize that. And it's just like, oh shit, like my parents said I could be whatever I want to be. They were lying to me.
Right, right.
Yeah. So
It's I totally get it from that standpoint too. I mean, I definitely tried as like I didn't for me when I worked with those kids, like um when they were there, like they were there and they were there to for me when I was a coach, like right, like they were there to have a good time. And like I wanted to make sure that like they felt every time they stepped into the weight room, it wasn't a question that like my attention was on them
mhm,
and that my support was fully in their corner. So it's I'm always going to have a skewed vision on it, I guess, um, because it's when you go to college, it's an experience, and when you're an athlete, it's even harder to have. I guess, the general run of the mill college experience. So um, it's, yeah, I don't know. I don't know. I have a soft spot. I have a soft
Yeah,
spot. I
I
do.
mean, in I mean, it's understandable. It's because, like you said, you were you had a different vantage point than other people. Because for other people, it's just a salacious, juicy story. It's like,
Yeah.
oh my god, like. But for you, it's like you're seeing the real world impact of what it's having on these kids
Yeah.
that
Yeah.
were just doing it for the love of the game, and to have a to have adults come in and tarnish that for them, it's fucked up.
It's out of their control. Right. And it sucks because there's nothing any of those kids could have ever done about that. Right.
Yeah,
So yeah, it's, again, it doesn't take away from what people did, and it doesn't make it right. Um, but I definitely felt for the people that had to go through that because it sucked. It definitely sucked. 100%. The people that were affected by it directly, I guess, which
yeah,
would have been the people that ended up getting a bad name, even though they probably didn't deserve it at all.
yeah. Didn't they really didn't do anything?
Yeah, but
Well, okay. On a lighter note, steroids. I'm kidding.
yeah, right. Those are fun.
Let's talk about the roids, shall
Yeah.
we? Now, no, but kind of going back to the technology part of it is so force plates. What I also wanted to bring up is that with artificial intelligence becoming more widespread and everything like that, and they're trying to find different applications. Do you see AI coming into sports analytics? And if so, like where do you think like it would have its first like iteration?
No, definitely. I think there's already a use for it, in many sense. Um, I think AI, and let's talk, when I say AI in this case, I'm talking like something like Chat GPT, right?
Oh, I was talking about Allen Iverson.
I mean, he's one of the greatest of all time, so I think the conversation just ends there. So
I mean, he's making a comeback. He's getting new knees.
he's gonna be back. I had a pair of Iversons when I was young. That's yeah, that's going way back though.
My fault.
I yeah, when I'm talking about AI in this case, like Chat GPT, right? Something like that. Because that's like the new hotness. It's the new thing that like kind of everybody can explore and enjoy. Um, I think one of the best things about that could be just the ability to aggregate data in a very quick sense.
Mhm.
So being able to pull or find things that would take hours by hand can be done in seconds. So it's a phenomenal tool in that sense. Um, it could be a phenomenal tool to, play right strategy for a game. And then it's up to the person to be able to look at that and say, I think that's a good idea, or I think that's a bad idea, right? Um, I think AI is a tool; it's not a replacement of anything. So I think in the most literal sense, it's a way for people to get things done quicker and more efficiently. But they have to understand that like it's not going to give an answer to every question. It's going to give context to certain questions or
Mhm.
give a little bit more background into what you might be inquiring about. So I think that's the important thing to note. Alternatively, visual AI or visual encoding of certain movements, I think something that could be interesting would be breaking down a highly technical, skilled sport, like something like baseball, let's say, where swing mechanics is so vitally important. Someone could swing in front of a camera and AI could 3D render that, remodel it to show them what their swing was, but also in turn show them what adjustments to make to achieve proper mechanics. Could be
Mm.
the same, could be done for golf, right? And I think that's just something to think about. I don't think it currently exists. It may or may not, but not that I've ever seen yet. But videoing someone, because coaches do it all the time, right? They video someone
Like
swing, someone,
lifts.
yeah, lifts or sprint mechanics,
Mhm.
and then AI could effectively go in, render that person's movement, and then re-replicate that same individual so that visually, and this is lending itself back to something in the sports psychology realm of imagery. So people before games would go through and just like visualize everything that they
Mhm.
might want to do during a game, visualize their success. This would effectively visualize that person in real time doing the proper thing with the proper mechanics, And athletes are very visual learners by nature, because that's how you learn. Like, if someone shows you something, you do it.
Yeah.
Now you get to see yourself do it. So like there's this another layer to it of like, oh, I can do that. That's me doing that in real time. So
And
I
with that,
think,
you can even overlay it so that you can see
yeah,
like where you're normally swinging or running at, and then like where you need to like maybe bring your knees up or extend or flex further out.
right. Yeah. It could be done to like the nth degree. I think the realm of possibility, because like that's the craziest thing I've seen so far is just the video rendering and of AIs, right? Like AI video replication of certain people or certain things, right? It's pretty incredible. Um, so I think in the term of sports, certainly could showcase someone performing something at a very high level that maybe they've yet to achieve, or maybe they achieve but inconsistently. Or, that's a tool that can be used by a coach to say, these are the adjustments you need to make, shown here. This is how you can actively physically perform those adjustments. You know, notice how on the AI render their foot placements here, their hip timing is lined up with their hand time, or like whatever it may be for that particular movement. Um, could be done showing that person physically themselves doing it perfectly, right? So I think that's a cool thing that can be done. And there's certainly
Could
like
that even be
AI.
used for physical therapy as well?
100%.
Like
Yeah.
getting an athlete back to those movements?
Or general population physical therapy, right? Because there's plenty of people that probably don't think they can do something, and maybe they can see themselves do it and then re-replicate that, right? So, uh, it has plenty of. I think it would have plenty of impact on a variety of uses. So I'm sure there's something that's similar, or is something out there like that that may could eventually be brought to my attention. I'm sure something like that probably exists in some capacity, but I think it only gets better with AI. So
And I guess even going further, and this is probably about 15, 20 years down the road, is like having something like that, but like having sensors hooked up to the athlete as well. So it's like while you perform this movement, I can say like it's like you're creating or you're generating force here, here, and here, and these parts are where you're weak. And I know that, like you said, with athletes being visual learners, is like if I can consciously now say to myself, like, okay, I need to like engage these muscles while I'm doing it. If I have a physical representation of it, then it's easier for me to kind of visualize and then do that.
right, I I know that like those sensor models do exist, but I don't know if it does that capacity. So I think it's the bridging of different tech into one kind of one singular use tool, right? I think
Mhm.
eventually over time, and this is probably maybe even closer than 10 or 15 years out, right? Because technological advancements are exponential, right? One thing gets invented and now it melds in three or four different things, which becomes this one universal tool for certain problems and issues, right? So, um, and like I said, in the past 10 years, the amount of tech that's been fused into sports has been astronomical. And I think it's only going to get refined as people find more use or better uses for certain things. So it'll
Oh,
definitely go in an interesting avenue, 100%.
yeah, it will. I think that like anything, like any type of technology, I think sometimes the application and how we as a society decide to use it does not always line up. And that's something I wanted to ask you about in just terms of just data analytics in sports science. Is that, do you see any ethical problems with having a very data driven like decision making aspect of sports?
Hmm. Um, I don't, I don't think there could be like this high level ethical issue with data in sport. Um, maybe I'm not nefarious enough to think of one. I don't know. Um,
Well, can I give you an example that I
yeah,
thought
could you please? Yeah, yeah, yeah.
about? in terms of high school recruitment
Sure.
and trying to distinguish like who gets the scholarship to go to school and who doesn't, using like having data be a not the sole factor but a contributing factor
Mhm.
to it, where someone who might be, I don't know, someone who might be 5'10" isn't going to look as appealing as a person who's 6'2" for being like a safety.
Sure. Well,
Like,
let me counter that real quick.
mhm.
Is there any ethical concerns with something like a GPA or SAT?
I would say no. And the reason for it is because with a GPA or SAT is that you you worked for it, and that is the result of your work, versus with the data it says this is a probability that it's a possibility that I might fail, versus with the GPA and SAT score it's like I took the test and this is the results of it.
See, I think, and this lends it back to like kind of a lot of what sports is where it becomes an N of one argument where it's like, oh, someone like Lionel Messi may not fit the mold,
Mhm,
but I would also argue someone like Messi would always break through, regardless of what the data may say, right?
mhm,
And when using data, it's you're hedging your bets to make the most informed decision you can about something that is going to impact an output. So whether that's wins or losses, and I think, you know, I don't think data will ever be a sole determinant. I certainly think it can be a component. And I do liken that to something like an SAT or a ACT or a GPA, because you can work for physical performance, right? There's certain aspects that you can work and hone in on, right? There's also some immutable traits that you'll never be able to expand on, like height, right? You only grow as tall as you're going to grow. But
mhm,
I think looking at sports again, it's not to say there's not a place for that person, right? There will always be a place for that person to play somewhere. Um, but at certain levels, if the expected output comes from comes from a particular mold or a particular outlook, you know, that person may, deserve some sort of consideration, right? And again, those N of one arguments like Lionel Messi will probably always break through the mold, right?
mhm,
So I think that's it's tough, right? I don't know if it's an ethical argument because in other areas it's not considered an ethical infraction when using data to determine someone's ability to perform, right? Where it may be a God-given trait, you can certainly do nothing and still score very high on those standardized tests.
mhm.
Or it may be someone that actively put the work in and achieved a similar score, right? So I think
I
I
guess
don't
my
know.
I guess
Yeah, go ahead.
where I was having a problem with it is that it's like where, and again I guess you can say this with SAT, with the SAT and GPA, but it can be used to deny someone access to education. And I think that's where I was saying like the ethical part of it is it's just like because of what this computer generated program spat out,
Mhm.
it like says that I won't be good for this position at this school. So I could probably still go there if I paid, but in terms of like scholarships and things like that, giving opportunities to kids that might not have financially been able to get there. It's like I think that's where it becomes a little bit more of where there could be an ethical problem. And I'll say this with SAT, the ethical problem with that isn't necessarily the the scores.
Mhm.
Well, it's not necessarily how they view the scores. Is the fact is it's like if you're from a more affluent uh, community, you
Mhm.
probably have more resources to
Yes.
SAT prep, so you will be getting a higher score. And with the, I guess with the sports analytics, is that it's like you might have access to a gym or something like that. Like it's harder. I feel like it's harder to draw a correlation between like access to a gym and better analytics versus like with the SAT, it might be like prep and um, score. But I feel like that's it still could be an ethical problem if children are not being granted access to certain programs because or in part of what a computer has said.
And I know we're going to agree on most things when it comes to this.
Mhm.
That lends itself to a larger issue that I think we've spent a lot of time talking about, and we have similar ideas and feelings towards.
Yes.
It's a larger systemic issue, obviously. Um, so I think I understand where you're coming from, and I do understand your viewpoint, and I do understand in that context how it can be seen as possibly like an ethical issue. Sure, totally. Um, and I do understand the concern. I do.
And I do understand your part is that like with like someone like Messi,
Mhm,
he'll because of like you said the God-given talent,
mhm,
like still going to be able to break through the barrier. But I feel like with a lot of people that might not have it to that extent,
mhm,
it might be like I don't know, say if Messi is a 9 out of 10 on God-given talent, and the other people might be like 6 out of 10.
mhm.
They don't have enough of that to break through the barriers that I feel like data-driven decisions could um, inadvertently put up.
Mhm. I totally and I
Also,
totally
with
understand.
Messi, didn't he take fucking hormones when he was little so like he wasn't short?
I don't know. I don't know. That I don't know about.
I
I
thought
mean, he he
I
is he is a magician though. It's probably one I would argue he's probably the best of all time.
how tall is Messi?
Oh, geez, not tall.
Because I feel like honestly, I feel like that I
Five
heard
seven. He's 5'7".
yeah, yeah. Because I think it was Messi. I think when he was younger, they gave him hormones because he was gonna be like maybe like 5'1" or something like that. And his parents were like, nah, you're not gonna be a short king.
I mean, he's a king either way, man. He made it.
Yeah, he
Absolutely
made it.
made it. Um, yeah, and I get it, and I think again, access to resources is a larger issue. Um,
And
and
yes,
if all things were um not equal, sorry, equitable,
yeah.
results would probably be different for many people. And I think that goes, and that's just outside of athletics. So um that's a obviously a goal that I think people should strive for is equitable access to resource. But I
Yeah.
think, yeah,
But I will say that in with some athletes, in spite of not having those things, like
still
just
shine through.
yeah, yeah.
Mhm.
And I guess for those people who are listening, that having stories like that does not give a pass to not do anything because you can't look at those stories and say, well, so and so made it out and they had nothing, so there's no reason why we should do anything. It's just like, no, just because one got out, you don't know how many didn't.
Right. Right. That's again.
But this is also far
Yeah.
from strength and condition
Right, right, right.
in analytics. There's
Mhm.
enough analytics that
Enough analytics.
yeah, enough of those types of analytics. We will stick with sports. Uh, no, but I'm not going to hold you up too much longer. But one of the other questions I wanted to ask you is that if I know we talked about effectively communicating to coaches, to a different audience, administration, things like that. If you were to go into a new program and the coach or the administration was highly resistant to these types of analytics, what would your pitch be to them to try to get them to come around?
um that's a really good question because my initial instinct would be don't put yourself in a headlock and don't go there. Right? Let the ship sink.
Nah, but they about to pay you some money.
Um, Professional integrity. I don't. um, I think that's, I always play the slow burn, right? Getting someone to be actively involved in the process is the starting point, and getting someone actively involved in a conversation that leads to a common goal of success should be the initial approach. Finding out what that person, what that department, what that coach cares about most
Mm,
and values most, and then saying, hey, I understand and I agree. Let me look into some ways that we can start to look at this further, quantify it, so that we can repeat it consistently. Because if you're being brought into a department or organization in sports, it's the repeated expectation of success. So finding how they found success before, and then taking their, let's say, abstract ideas, concepts, whatever, and then applying information to that and saying, hey, this is what I found. This is how I think we can consistently do this. So finding out what works for them, because people will probably almost always understand what works for them. And then you can start to have the conversations about what doesn't work well. And you can show them why it doesn't, and then maybe how you can improve. So providing value by showing that you can listen, conceptualize, and then visualize, to have a conversation about how to change for the better based on that person's prerequisites or understandings. So that would be my best advice for someone that gets themselves into a situation like that. You need to give credence and control a little bit to the decision maker first. And then you can start to insert yourself as a person that's a team player, whether their initial preconceived notions are correct or not. You have to find a way to meet them where they're at,
mm.
right? Like we talked about, and then show value by saying, I'm listening to you. I'm not here to provide you answers you didn't ask for. I'm here to showcase you what you want to see, but also provide some suggestions that could lead to different conversations that might yield better results.
Okay. And
That's
if
my
all that
approach.
fails, quit.
Yeah.
Uh,
If all that fails, fire up indeed.
okay. So my last question, I always ask this, for what advice would you give to people either getting into the field of sports analytics
Mm.
or freshly got to a new program and they're trying to figure out what to do? What advice would you give to those people?
Um, be open minded. And I think that goes for anything, honestly. Um, Approach your career with a sense of curiosity and and understanding that not everyone's going to match that same energy or level. Understand that you're going to have to get a lot of people on board with what you're trying to say, and understand that in the next 5 years, your understanding of a lot of things are probably going to change, and that's okay. It's okay to be wrong. Accepting that and moving on is important. Can't dwell on that stuff in the past. So getting yourself into a situation where you have a good relationship with the people you work with and work for is going to be paramount, because that's how you're going to have the best conversations. And that kind of goes back to the last question of, like, if you get into a situation like they're not going to respect you from the get-go, don't go there. But, you know, understanding that not everyone in this field is going to look at you and the work that you do the same, or are going to value it the same, and be okay with that, because you don't necessarily need to win them over today. It can be in a week, it can be in a month, it can be in a year. But go into it with the sense that the work you do is important. The work you can do can be highly beneficial, and in time can yield good results. But understanding that it might take some people longer than others to come around or start to understand what you're trying to say, and actively trying to pursue an avenue that will allow everyone to be on the same page.
Mm. Yes, and I think that, if I can add a little bit to that,
Go,
is
please.
remembering why you do what you do, and just trusting the process.
Hmm.
Because a lot of times it's like, I'm pretty sure that there were times in your career where you're kind of just like, you know what, I don't kind of want to do this today, or it's like I'm not feeling it, or feeling like people don't appreciate you, or this might not work out. But um, trusting the process, and then like you said, is like, um, when having the kids come into the gym, and like having an environment where they know that they're welcomed, and this is going to be a enjoyable experience for them. I feel like that's kind of you reaffirming like why you do what you do.
Right. I 100% agree. 100%.
Well, could you do you have anything coming up? This is a part for some plugs, any
um,
events, any more podcasts you about to be on?
uh, that no, I don't, not that I have lined up right now. Um, I don't know. Stay tuned. Follow me on Instagram if you like to see some stuff. If you like data and sports. Um,
Where
it's
would how would people follow you?
I think it's just Teofe Ziemnicki. Is
You
my
know,
name going to be anywhere on this?
it's gonna be, yeah, it's gonna be in the description, but just
Perfect.
for the sake of people don't know how to spell Ziemnicki.
Neither do I. So we're at a tough point. It's
It
T.
seems we've reached the impasse.
this this is where we don't agree. It's Tziemnicki. I should be hopefully the only one that pops up.
No
But
underscore one.
maybe there's an underscore somewhere in there. It's got to be.
No, I don't think so. I
No,
think,
I don't think it is. No, I think I got rid of that. Yeah,
but
yeah,
if anything, I'll put either a link, or I'll just put your handle in the description.
yeah. Cool, man.
Well,
Sweet.
I want to say thank you for
Yeah.
choosing to
Thank
come
you.
on.
Thank
Um,
you.
we definitely gonna have you back, because there's some other topics that we can definitely get into.
As
We just need
always.
to, we just need to curate the questions to make sure that we both have jobs by the end of this. Uh,
Right.
but no, I want to say thank you again for choosing to come on.
Yeah. No, I appreciate you reaching out and having me, man. Always. It's great to talk. So look forward to seeing you the next time in person for sure.
Of course, of course. And everyone, that has been another episode of Toon Talks with the Pharaoh, and I'll see y'all next week.